The number on the exit scale screen didn't match, and I stared at it for about 3 seconds, unable to process it properly. 800 pounds more than when I arrived. I hadn't opened the cargo hold, hadn't stopped anywhere, hadn't done anything different from what I do every week at that dock. I went to ask the supervisor on duty what was happening, and he looked at me in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't confusion on his face. It was something else. I knew that dock in Laredo well. I'd driven that route about 6 times in the last 2 months, and the process was always the same. I'd arrive around 10 at night, check the manifest with the coordinator, wait for the loading to finish, sign and leave. It rarely took more than an hour and a half. But that Thursday, the shift was running late even before I arrived, and you could feel it in the air, in the way the workers moved too fast, in the pallets arriving out of order, in the coordinator talking on the radio the whole time without stopping in the same place for more than 30 seconds. The cargo consisted of industrial equipment, sealed boxes on wooden pallets, nothing out of the ordinary according to the manifest. Rex Tatum isn't the type to question things when the paperwork is correct and the coordinator confirms it. I signed the cargo receipt around 11:15. The truck was already being closed when I returned to the truck, and I saw from a distance the worker sealing the door. I saw it, but I didn't go over to check the number. I'd never needed to. What I noticed, and didn't think much of at the time, was that 2 of the workers who closed the cargo container left through the side of the dock instead of going back into the warehouse. I thought they were going to smoke. The side area didn't have good lighting, so I only saw their silhouettes turning the corner and disappearing. I went to start the engine, checked the GPS, and went out to the departure scale, which was less than half a mile away inside the complex. The weighbridge operator handed me the ticket without saying anything unusual, but I was already looking at the number before he even finished printing it. 832 pounds above the weight registered on the manifest. I asked him to run it again, thinking it was a reading error, and the second number came out almost the same. I stood there in the truck for about 20 seconds trying to understand how that was possible, because I hadn't stopped anywhere between the dock and the weighbridge. I got out, went to the back, and opened the trunk. The boxes were there, stacked correctly, pallets in place, nothing visibly different. But when I lowered the flashlight to the floor of the trunk, I saw the seal. It was there, intact in appearance, the seal I had seen the worker put on from a distance. The problem was that it was on the floor, leaning against the side wall, not on the door handle where it should have been. I picked it up with 2 fingers and looked at the number. It matched the manifest, but it wasn't securing anything. I stared at the trunk doors for a moment, trying to piece it all together. There was a new seal on the handle, different, with no number registered on any paper I had with me. I tucked the seal off the floor into my jacket pocket without thinking too much. It was instinct, and went back to the scale operator to ask if there was a supervisor available. I didn't want to leave there with the wrong weight and a seal that wasn't mine in the trunk. The supervisor showed up in less than 2 minutes, which already seemed fast to me for someone I had just asked for the scale operator. He was a tall guy, wearing an orange safety jacket, clipboard in hand, and went straight to the storage compartment without asking any questions, as if he already knew what he was going to find. He opened the doors, looked for about 10 seconds, and wrote something on the clipboard. I asked what was happening, and he said he needed to call someone, that it was standard procedure. His voice was too calm for a situation that was anything but standard. The 2 security guards arrived before I could call the dispatcher. They came from the side of the complex, the same path the workers had taken when they disappeared after closing the truck's cargo hold, a fact I only connected later. They were 2 guys I'd never seen at that dock before, with no visible badges, wearing black vests unlike the standard ones I'd seen on other nights. One of them stood near my truck's cab without touching it, but close enough for me to understand it wasn't a casual encounter. The other stood next to the supervisor, watching the cargo hold. That's when the tone changed. The supervisor asked me for the documents differently this time, not as a formality, and when I handed him the manifest and the weighing ticket, he passed them both to security without even looking at me. I tried to explain the seal, took it out of my jacket pocket to show them, and they both looked at me in a way that made me put it back without finishing the sentence. Rex Tatum had already understood that the conversation had changed in nature. He just didn't yet know exactly in which direction. I asked to call my dispatcher, and the supervisor said I could, but one of the security guards positioned himself between me and the truck cab, in such a way that I would have to pass through him to reach the cell phone that was in the dashboard holder. He didn't physically block me, but the message was clear. I stood at the back of the truck with the weighing ticket over the heads of the security guards and the swapped seal in my pocket. And for the first time that night, I felt that the situation was bigger than a weighing error. The supervisor said he was going to open the storage compartment for an internal review before registering any formal incident, and I didn't understand what that meant until I saw the 2 security guards enter the compartment wearing gloves. It wasn't an inspection. They knew exactly where to go, went straight to the back row, moved 2 boxes aside, and started stacking smaller items that had nothing to do with the manifest I had signed. Hard packages, wrapped in dark plastic, which they placed on the floor of the compartment in an organized, almost rehearsed way. I stood there watching for about 3 seconds, unable to say anything. When I took my cell phone out of my jacket pocket, the security guard who was near the booth came towards me before I could open the camera. He didn't say anything, just put his hand on my arm with enough force to make it clear that it wasn't requested. I tried to break free. He increased the pressure, and then the second security guard climbed down from the compartment and came from the side. Rex Tatum isn't small, but there were 2 of them, and the supervisor stood there watching with his clipboard in hand without interfering at any point. I was pushed against the side of the truck and my cell phone fell onto the asphalt. What I didn't know at the time was that there was a security camera from the complex pointed directly at the exit scale, covering exactly that stretch of asphalt where I was. I didn't know because I hadn't looked up, but it was there, and it had been recording since before I reached the scale, since before the supervisor appeared, since before the security guards came from the side wearing gloves. I would only find this out much later. The police arrived 6 minutes later, called by the supervisor, and the scene they found was me leaning against the side of the truck with 2 security guards beside me, the cargo area open, the packages on the ground, and the unregistered seal sticking out of my jacket pocket when one of the officers asked me to empty my pockets. I tried to explain the weighing ticket, the original seal, the workers who had disappeared to the side, but the words came out in the wrong order, and I knew I wasn't sounding innocent. I knew because I wouldn't have believed it myself. I spent the night in a holding room at the county sheriff's office, not in a cell, but the difference hardly mattered. I tried calling the dispatcher 3 times on the landline the agent let me use, and all 3 times it went to voicemail. On the 4th attempt, a clerk I'd never spoken to before answered and said she'd pass on the message. She didn't. Rex Tatum discovered that night that freight companies disappear quickly when the name on the paperwork is the driver's, not the company's. The bail was paid 2 days later by a lawyer I'd never met, hired by my family. And when I left, the truck was still being held at the Laredo compound as part of the seizure. The cargo had been cataloged as evidence, the manifest I signed became an indictment, and the seal I'd kept in my pocket, the one I thought would help me, was listed as an item collected at the scene without any note on how it had gotten to me. The narrative the police had concocted was simple, and I appeared at the center of it without any obvious loopholes. It was the lawyer who requested the security camera footage from the complex, not the police. It took almost 3 weeks for the request to be processed and the recordings to arrive, and when they did, they showed the 2 security guards entering the truck with gloves on before the police arrived. They showed the supervisor taking notes on a clipboard while they moved the packages, and they showed me being pushed against the truck while trying to film. They also showed the 2 workers who had disappeared down the side of the dock returning to the warehouse 20 minutes after I left, something no one had mentioned at any point in the investigation. The case didn't fall apart immediately. It took another 6 weeks after the footage, hearings, testimonies, and a change of lawyers on the prosecution side. When they finally dismissed it, I had lost my contract with the transport company, which had unilaterally terminated it in the first week, citing a conduct clause, and the truck had been detained long enough for me to miss 2 other scheduled routes. The dock company was never formally charged with anything. The 2 security guards disappeared before any summons. I never found out who the 2 security guards were. They weren't registered in the system of the outsourced security company that operated in that complex. At least that's what the lawyer told me when he tried to summon witnesses. The 2 workers who returned along the side of the dock were identified, but when the police went looking for them, one had resigned the morning after the incident and the other simply didn't show up for work anymore. The clipboard supervisor remained employed for at least 2 months afterward, until I stopped following him. I don't know what happened to him after that, and I don't think I want to know. The cargo that was in my truck was never publicly described in the documents they had access to. It only appears as material seized in an active investigation. I still travel routes through South Texas, still pass through complexes similar to the one in Laredo, still sign manifests and wait for loading at night docks. The difference is that now I photograph the seal before leaving, photograph the number, photograph the closed truck bed, and keep the entry-weighing ticket along with the exit ticket every time without exception. It's not paranoia. It's what 832 pounds teaches you when you pay out of your own pocket to learn. If you're enjoying the story so far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these stories to more people. The officer pulled his car over behind mine on the shoulder of Interstate 76, and I stopped, thinking it was speeding or a broken light. I went to hand over my license with my hand out the window, and he told me to get out of the vehicle. He didn't explain why. When I got out, he already had his hand on his holster and told me to keep my hands visible. And then he said there was an arrest warrant out for me related to a hit-and-run accident in Kentucky. Walt Drummond had never set foot in Kentucky in his life. The first ticket arrived in the mail about 6 weeks before that stop on Interstate 76. It was from Indiana, a weight violation at a weigh station, $240 in the name of Walt Drummond with my CDL number printed in the right corner of the document. I called the number on the notice, explained that I had never driven a route in Indiana that month, and the operator said I could contest it in writing. I sent the contestation, received no response, and after 2 weeks I assumed it had been a system error and forgot about it. The second ticket came from Tennessee, 3 weeks later, a speeding violation on a state highway I didn't recognize by name. This time I didn't even call, I went straight to the website, and when I tried to contest it, the system asked for the vehicle number associated with the violation. The number that appeared wasn't my truck. It was from a license plate I had never seen before. I thought it was a typo, wrote it down on a piece of paper and left it on the kitchen table unresolved. The paper was still there when I left for my route that morning. What I didn't know, and only understood after much conversation with a lawyer and investigator, was that someone had photographed my laminated CDL, Certificate of Taxpayer Identification, at a gas station in Columbus, about 2 months before all this. I didn't remember leaving the document with anyone, but I remembered placing it on the counter while paying for coffee and signing the gas receipt. 30 seconds, maybe less. Enough time. Walt Drummond stared at the ceiling of that police station room in Ohio, thinking about how many times he had done that without thinking. The officer let me hold the warrant for about 20 seconds before taking it back. That was enough time for me to read the date of the accident in Kentucky, February 23rd, a Thursday, and feel something click into place. That Thursday I had made a delivery in Dayton, Ohio, leaving at 6 in the morning and returning to the trucking company's yard at 4:30 in the afternoon. I had a log of arrival and departure, a camera at the gate, and a signature of receipt in Dayton. Kentucky was more than 4 hours from Dayton. I tried to explain this to the officer there on the side of the road, standing with my hands visible and the wind from the highway blowing through me, and he listened expressionlessly. He said he understood what I was saying, but that the warrant was valid, and the procedure was to take me to the police station regardless of any explanation I gave there. Walt Drummond isn't the type to argue with an armed officer on the side of the road, so I got in the car without handcuffs. He asked me to leave it like that for now, and I did. On the way, I tried to mentally organize what I had: the route from Dayton, the entry log from the yard, the name of the manager who had signed the receipt. I had everything. I just needed someone to listen. At the police station, I asked to see the complete accident report from Kentucky before saying anything. The investigator on duty brought a thin folder with 3 pages and a black and white printed photo. It was a long cab truck, the same color as mine, approximately the same configuration, with its side crumpled against the guardrail. The license plate was partially visible in the photo, and the first 2 characters were the same as mine. I stared at that photo for a while without speaking, because for the first time since the encounter I understood that the fines from Indiana and Tennessee hadn't been a system error at all. The investigator left the folder on the table and went to get coffee, and I stayed looking at the map with the circled markings. There were 4 points beyond Kentucky, and I ran my finger over each one without touching the paper. Indiana on Interstate 65, Tennessee on Interstate 24, Georgia on Interstate 75, Mississippi on Interstate 55. I picked up my cell phone and opened the route app I use at work, which keeps a history of routes, and started comparing. It took me about 3 minutes to see what was in front of me. Each infraction had occurred on a highway that was between 50 and 80 miles parallel to a route I had taken in the previous 30 days. Not on the same road, never on the same road, but always on an adjacent highway, always in the same direction I had traveled, always with a difference of 2 to 4 weeks from my passage through the region. Whoever was using my identity wasn't operating randomly. They were following some logic that had to do with the places I had been. Walt Drummond stared at the map for about 20 seconds, trying to understand how someone knew this because I hadn't disclosed any route to anyone besides the dispatcher. When the investigator returned with the coffee, I showed him what I had found, placed my cell phone next to the map and pointed to each route. He stopped fiddling with his cup and looked more attentively than he had looked at anything since I arrived. He said it was a relevant observation and that he would record it. It wasn't the enthusiasm I wanted, but it was different from the silence before. I asked him to check if anyone with access to my programmed routes had a history of unauthorized access to the carrier's system. He noted it down without comment. What unsettled me most wasn't the pattern itself, but what it implied. To follow my route with that precision, someone needed to know in advance where I was going, not just where I had been. The CDL photographed on the counter at the gas station in Columbus explained the data cloning, but didn't explain how they found out about the routes. I started thinking about who else besides the customs broker had access to this type of information, and the list was shorter than I expected and longer than I wanted. The investigator left to check access to the carrier's system, and I stayed in the room for almost an hour without any news. I picked up my cell phone and started looking at the conversation history with the dispatcher, trying to identify anything out of the ordinary. Nothing in the messages themselves, normal language, route confirmations, schedules. But when I looked at the dates, the routes had been confirmed in writing, and compared them with the dates of the infractions on the map, the interval was always the same. Between 2 and 4 days after the written confirmation of the route, an infraction would appear on a parallel highway. Always, without exception. I called the dispatcher without thinking too much. I just wanted to hear his voice. I didn't know exactly what I was going to ask. He answered on the second ring, which was normal. But when I said I was at a police station in Ohio answering questions about the infractions in my name, the line went silent for about 4 seconds. It wasn't a silence of surprise. It was the silence of someone calculating what to say. I said his name and asked if he had passed on my planned routes to anyone. The call dropped. I tried calling back 3 times, but the number wouldn't connect anymore. It went straight to an inactive number message, which I was sure didn't exist 5 minutes earlier. I knocked on the door of the room and asked to speak to the investigator immediately. When he came in, I showed him my phone, the call history, the inactive number message, and explained the pattern I had found between the route confirmations and the dates of the infractions. He looked at the phone, looked at the map, and this time didn't say he was going to register it. He left the room without saying anything and returned with another agent I hadn't seen before. Walt Drummond understood at that moment that the investigation had changed in scope, but that change didn't solve anything for me that day. The transport company was formally contacted that afternoon, and the dispatcher didn't show up for work. The company said he had resigned by text message that morning before my call, which was technically impossible because I had confirmed the route with him the day before without any indication that he was going to leave. The transport company's operations manager remained silent when the investigator presented the pattern of dates, and that silence lasted long enough for me to understand that I wasn't the only one being investigated there, and that the company probably knew more than it was going to admit at that moment. The request for the Columbus gas station security camera footage was made by the investigator that same week, and I only found out the result almost 3 weeks later, when the lawyer my cousin had recommended called me on a Saturday morning. The recording showed a man in a baseball cap and dark jacket standing behind me in the checkout line, cell phone in hand, photographing my driver's license on the counter while I was signing the fuel receipt. It lasted less than 10 seconds. I hadn't even moved from my spot. The lawyer said the image was clear enough for identification and that it had been forwarded to the federal investigation. Walt Drummond sat on the edge of his bed listening to this and thinking about how many times he had placed documents on counters without looking back. The administrative license suspension process and the criminal proceedings were running in separate instances that didn't communicate at any speed compatible with my situation. The warrant was dropped 6 weeks after the alibis were formally verified and cross-referenced with the carrier's records, but the administrative suspension of the driver's license followed its own schedule, with a hearing scheduled for 42 days after the appeal was filed. During that time, I couldn't work. I couldn't drive the truck. I couldn't do anything that depended on my license. I did odd jobs at a warehouse for 3 weeks, loading boxes by the hour, which was the only work I could get without showing professional qualifications. The trucking company terminated the contract by email while the investigation of the shipping agent was still open. The letter stated that the termination was due to temporary operational impossibility, which was a way of avoiding mentioning the name of the lawsuit or assuming any responsibility for what the shipping agent himself had done using their system. Walt Drummond didn't sue the company because the lawyer said the cost and time weren't worth it, given what I would get in the end, and I trusted that assessment without the energy to argue. 5 months without an active license, without a contract, without regular income, because of 30 seconds at a gas station counter in Columbus. The customs broker was never formally located. The investigator called me about 4 months later to say that the case was active, but that he had no concrete updates to share, which was a way of saying that the trail had gone cold. The shipping company cooperated with the investigation enough to avoid being indicted, and little beyond that. If anyone besides the customs broker knew about the scheme within the company, that information didn't reach me, and probably won't. Walt Drummond learned that an active federal investigation and a solved federal investigation are two very different things, and that the latter is not guaranteed by the former. What I still can't answer for sure is how the dispatcher got involved in the scheme, whether he sought out the gang or if the gang approached him first, how long it had been going on before me, and if other drivers from the same company were being used in the same way without knowing it. I still drive routes through Ohio and neighboring states. I still receive route confirmations by text message. I still stop at gas stations in the middle of the night with my documents in my pocket. The difference is that now I don't put anything on the counter. I keep everything in my jacket's inside pocket and only take it out when I need to show it directly to someone. A small adjustment. A high cost to learn. The weigh station agent placed the open manifest on the counter and pointed to a specific line without saying anything for about 3 seconds. It was a list of controlled substances I had never seen before in any version of that document, and the name of the substance meant nothing to me, but the classification code next to it was red. I looked at him, looked at the paper, looked back at him. Curtis Boland had signed that manifest 40 minutes earlier without reading every page. Because that's what everyone did. Because that's what I had always done. And now there was a sheet in the middle of that document that I was absolutely certain hadn't been there when I signed it. The dock at Joliet that morning was running late even before I parked the truck. You could tell by the way the coordinator kept looking at his watch and talking on the radio at the same time. Curtis Boland had been driving that route for almost 3 months. Always the same dock, always the same process, and the coordinator was a laid-back guy who rarely rushed anything. That morning he was different, going through the paperwork too quickly, turning pages without waiting for me to finish reading, stacking sheets on his clipboard in an unusual order. I asked if there was a problem, and he said the next shift was coming up and he needed to close before the changeover. There were 8 sheets in total: a standard freight manifest, a cargo declaration, an internal weighing receipt, routine forms that I had signed variations of hundreds of times. I was turning page by page, slower than the coordinator wanted, and when there were 3 sheets left, one slipped off the clipboard and fell to the floor between us. I bent down, picked it up, put it back on the stack without looking at the contents, and continued signing. The coordinator didn't say anything, didn't pause, didn't react. I finished, handed him his copy, folded mine, and put it in the document holder in the cabin. What I noticed, but didn't quite register at the time, was that the sheet that had fallen had a slightly different texture from the others. The paper was a little thicker. The print had stronger contrast. I noticed it when I picked it up from the ground, but my mind was elsewhere. The arrival time in Springfield, the lunch I hadn't yet had. At the way station in Illinois, 40 minutes later, when the agent opened the manifest on the counter and started flipping through it, I saw that sheet from afar even before he stopped at it. Thicker paper, darker print. But this time I stopped to look. I told the agent I needed to see the document before responding to anything, that there was a situation at the dock that morning I wanted to explain. And he looked at me for a couple of seconds before turning the clipboard towards me. I grabbed the manifest with both hands and went straight to the thicker sheet of paper, which was fifth in the stack. It was a product declaration page with a header similar to the rest of the document, but not identical, a slightly different font, and a slightly wider line spacing. The list of substances in the body of the sheet had classification codes I didn't recognize, but that wasn't what stopped me. In the bottom right corner of the sheet was an approval stamp with the date. The month on the stamp was March. That morning was the second week of January. I stared at that stamp for a moment without speaking, trying to understand if I had read it wrong, and I read it again. March. Curtis Boland held in his hand a sheet stamped with a month that hadn't yet happened. Inside a manifest he had signed 40 minutes earlier, thinking it was standard documentation. I turned the sheet towards the agent and pointed to the stamp without saying anything. The agent looked at the stamp, looked at me, and calmly took the document back with a composure that made me more uncomfortable than if he had reacted urgently. He said he would need to call the inspection supervisor and that I should stay put. I asked if I could call the dock coordinator in Joliet to confirm what had happened to the documents, and he said I could after the supervisor arrived. It wasn't a direct no, but it was a no. I stood there at the counter with the manifest beside me and the March stamp in my head, trying to figure out who had put that sheet in the pile and when. The supervisor arrived in about 8 minutes, an older man with glasses on a cord around his neck, who picked up the manifest and went straight to the sheet without needing anyone to point it out. He examined it silently for about 2 minutes, turned it over, went back to the front and placed it on the counter with excessive care, as if the paper were evidence, which technically it already was. Curtis Boland asked permission to use his cell phone while the supervisor examined it, and the original agent nodded yes. I called the number of the dock coordinator in Joliet that I had saved on my cell phone, the same number I had been using for 3 months, and it rang 7 times without being answered. I then called the general number of the dispatch company, and the operator who answered went to check the shift log for that morning. She was silent for about 40 seconds, came back, and said that the usual coordinator had been absent due to a medical problem and that a substitute had covered the shift. I asked for the substitute's name. She said that the first name was on file, that it was a common name, nothing that would help identify anyone, and that the last name was illegible on the coverage form. Curtis Boland held his cell phone in his hand, processing what this meant. Because someone covering a shift at a loading dock needs to have a complete registration in the system, and an illegible last name on a coverage form isn't an administrative error. It's intentional omission. The supervisor finished the analysis and called the agent for a separate conversation near the window of the station, away from me. They stayed like that for about 5 minutes, and I stayed at the counter trying to hear something without success. When they returned, the supervisor had the manifest inside a transparent plastic bag, and the agent had an open notepad. They asked if I knew the dock substitute by name, if I had seen anyone besides the coordinator handling the documents before signing, if I had left the cabin at any point while the cargo was being loaded. The questions were too precise to be routine. I answered calmly, yes to the last question. I had gone down to check the fit of one of the locks on the cargo hold for about 3 minutes while the loading was finishing. 3 minutes away from the cabin where the document holder was open on the passenger seat, with the manifest inside. The agent wrote something down and underlined it in the notepad. I didn't need to ask what it was. I already knew it was those 3 minutes, and that those 3 minutes would appear in everything that came after. The supervisor asked to inspect the cargo hold, and I opened it without hesitation because there was no reason not to. and because at that moment, cooperating was the only thing I could control. There were 3 agents. 2 I hadn't seen before came from a room at the back of the station and entered the hold with flashlights without waiting for instructions. Curtis Boland stayed outside observing, with the original agent standing about 2 steps away, not blocking, but present. It took less than 4 minutes for one of the agents to call the supervisor from inside. They climbed into the hold together, and when they came down, the supervisor had in his hand a smaller package than the others, wrapped differently, in thinner plastic, without an identification label. It wasn't the same color as the rest of the cargo, which was all in cardboard boxes with the sender's company logo. This package was neutral, without any markings, wedged between 2 pallets in the second row on the left, exactly where I wouldn't have reached without moving cargo in front. Someone knew enough about the standard arrangement of that type of cargo to hide something where a driver wouldn't accidentally look. The original agent approached and told me I needed to accompany him inside the weigh station, that the process from there required formal documentation. He didn't use the word detained, but the sequence was the same. Curtis Boland entered the weigh station knowing the trap had 2 layers he hadn't seen, and that the stamp with the wrong month, which he himself had pointed out to the agent as proof the document was fake, now shared space with an unidentified physical item found in his truck bed. One thing helped, the other complicated things, and both would be in the same report. What happened in the next 20 minutes was too fast to process in the right order. Handcuffs, reading of rights, the cell phone being placed in a plastic bag with a numbered label, the truck key being handed to the supervisor. I had pointed out the fake document before any agent asked. I had cooperated in everything. I had opened the truck bed without hesitation, and yet I left the Illinois weigh station with my hands behind my back while 2 other drivers in line watched from their truck cabs without getting out. The bail was paid by the company the next day, without me asking for it, and without anyone explaining why they decided to do so before any formal legal advice. Curtis Boland spent a night in a Sangamon County holding cell thinking about exactly that issue, because a company that pays bail quickly is either protecting the driver or protecting itself, and the 2 motivations lead to different places. When the company lawyer showed up the next morning to pick me up, I asked directly what their interest was in getting me out of there quickly, and he said it was standard procedure for employees. He wasn't an employee, he was an independent contractor. He didn't explain the difference. The internal investigation confirmed in the following 2 weeks what I had suspected since the weigh station. The dock cameras in Joliet showed the replacement handling my cabin's document holder during the 3 minutes I had gotten out to check the cargo hold lock. A clear, unambiguous image. The same man had entered the loading yard 40 minutes before my scheduled arrival time, meaning he knew the time in advance, and had left through the side service entrance shortly after I departed. His full name appeared when they cross-referenced the image with the gate's access registration, which recorded biometrics. He had entered with the credentials of another employee who was on vacation. The meeting with the company's operations manager took place 5 days after my release, in a small conference room with their lawyer in a corner, and me without any intermediary by my side, because that's how I wanted it. Curtis Boland placed a list of 3 items on the table before the manager finished sitting down. A portable scanner for document verification at the dock, mandatory before any signature. Photographic record of each page of the manifest at the time of signature, archived in the system with a timestamp, and a formal protocol for identifying shift substitutes with prior confirmation to the driver. I said I was still available for routes, but that without these 3 items implemented, I would no longer sign anything at any of their docks. The manager looked at the list, looked at the lawyer, and didn't say no. The replacement identified by the cameras was indicted 6 weeks later, but who else coordinated the operation besides him? How did the physical cargo get into the truck without a trace in the dock's entry log? Did anyone inside the company know anything before the incident? These questions remain unanswered, and I've stopped expecting them to be. The scanner has been in the truck since the week after the meeting with the manager. The company has at least formally complied with the 3 items, and Curtis Boland photographs each manifest page before signing it ever since, checks the serial number sequence, and scans the codes when present. It takes 4 extra minutes per document. No one has complained yet. What I can't get out of my head is the sheet of paper falling to the floor between us and me, bending down to pick it up without looking. Thicker paper, darker print, and I put it back on the stack and continued because the coordinator was in a hurry, and I was thinking about lunch. Every time I pick up a manifesto and feel the different texture between the pages, I pause for a second before turning the page. It doesn't take long at all, but I stop. Thank you for staying until the end. If you enjoy these types of human-based horror stories, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Quiet and turn on